What's up, people? I'd like to welcome you to the Strength School Training and Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Malcolm Cooper, and today's a very special episode because it is our very first episode. That's right, episode number 1. And I have my good friend and colleague, Kenton Stout, on here with me of Stout Performance. Kenton, how are you?
I'm doing good, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, man. I can't complain. Some strange times we're in, but making it happen.
Definitely some times that we've never seen before.
No, man, it's weird. It's really bizarre when you think like that. Pretty much, at least to some small degree, everybody kind of in the world, or for the most part, knows what you're going through. I don't think that we could ever really point to any other time in human history and say that like oh shit, like, yeah, man, I kind of relate to the folks in China right now. You know what I mean? Like, you kind of know.
That is very true. That's a weird way to look at it, but yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's been interesting. But so are you still in Mason?
It's the Lebanon area. It's closest to Mason, but a little bit outside of it.
Okay, yeah. So Lebanon, Ohio. So I heard, and I think you said earlier before we started recording that y'all are starting your gyms back up on May 26th.
Yeah. Our governor, Mike DeWine, gave the go-ahead to start opening up gyms May 26th. So as long as those facilities are, following the laid out guidelines, they're good to go. So that'll be good for me and my clients and every other gym goer out there.
Yeah, I know people have been chomping at the bit to get back in there. Do you know what the guidelines are, as far as gyms being able to open?
I'm not 100% sure. Joe Sullivan, I don't know if you follow him. He's a powerlifter in Columbus. Mm-hmm. He released some guidelines that I guess the task force was working on. They're pretty basic, just make sure you keep your distance. It looks like we'll be able to do group classes depending on how many people we get in the group. It just depends. Each gym gets, bigger classes than others. Our gym usually has 10 people at most. You could have big gyms like Lifetime that have like 20 or 30 people. So it just depends on the gym, but it looks like it should be good to go for our gym.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so we're opening on Monday, actually, the 18th. And so there's an occupancy law or restriction, I guess, and you have to operate at 25% of your, occupancy, which my gym, Silverback Gym here in Conroe, is, I think our occupancy is like 200 people. So that means we can have 50 people in there at one time, which I don't think that we ever have 50 people all at one time. So it's kind of business as usual for us as far as occupancy. And then one of the strange things was that you can't provide access to showers or locker rooms. So we had to think like, okay, our showers and locker rooms are all like, and the restrooms are all like one thing, so it's like, how do you block it off? So I guess we're just going to tape off the actual lockers and then lock the shower, the shower doors so that people can't use them.
Yeah,
it's just interesting.
Yeah, it's be interesting to see what happens. But, I think it would be good for people to get back to normal, whether it's, being at a gym or going out to eat or whatever it is you like to do.
You going to go sit in a restaurant?
I don't know, man. To be honest with you, probably not right away. Not because I'm necessarily afraid of getting the coronavirus, but I don't feel like getting sick and having it mess up my training. I'm really weird when it comes to that kind of stuff. So even before the coronavirus was going around, if I had a really good training block, I would be OCD about washing my hands because the last thing I want is like to get sick and that training block to get ruined. And it seems stupid, but it's when it happens and you're like making headway, man, it sucks.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. What about you? Do you think you'll go to a restaurant?
No, No, I'm Mr. Conservative, man. Like when it comes to like anything that involves, and people can debate the level of risk, but there's some risk involved we can all probably, agree on. When it comes to that, I'm gonna usually take the path of staying at home. But I already do that anyway. So, my wife and I, we don't go out much. We do some brunches here and there. That was kind of our thing, was weekly brunch. But other than that, we're kind of homebodies anyway. And we've fortunately been able to train because of me, working for the gym and so we haven't missed a beat there. But I have no desire to walk through a mall. I don't want to go to a movie. Um, you know, I saw somewhere, I think maybe even Shanghai, that Disney World was opening back up. I was like, no, no,
There's definitely
no
a
way.
risk reward to those kind of things. It's like, how badly do I want to go to a mall? Not very badly.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's where it's like, okay, you're gonna do what's worth it to you. Like gyms, people are more likely gonna take that risk because us meatheads, that's what's important to us. And so I understand people willing to go mix it up in a gym, before. I mean, it was funny seeing like all the people wanting the barbershops and salons and stuff open because I haven't had hair since like 2003. So I'm like, who cares about those? You know what I mean? Like, cut your own fucking hair at home. Like, you're good. But not everybody has a clean cut up top. So,
Right.
but yeah. But do you do all your training at home, or do you do, like I'm talking about your own like lifting? You do that at your house, or do you do that in the gym you work at?
I do all my training at home. I was lucky enough to get a squat rack and all the weights and things like that before this ever happened. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually never used it because I work at a gym, so I just work out there. But it just worked out nicely that I had a gym in my basement. I mean, squat rack, deadlift platform, and a bench. Nothing crazy. But as a powerlifter, that's all I need. So I've been lucky there. What about you?
Yeah, man. Like I said, my wife and I haven't missed a beat. Just been training normally in an empty gym. It's going to be weird when the gym opens on Monday because I started implementing some supersets and things that I couldn't do before because there were just people
Oh,
there. And so I'm going to have to be a little craftier with the way I do that, and making sure that I'm not, trying to, not going to be in anybody else's space or anybody, and not just because of, Rona, but just because I don't want to, impose on anybody. Because I try to be, conscientious of everybody having their opportunity to get their lift in. So
right.
uh, with it being nobody there, it's just, yeah, I got a superset on one side of the gym. I want to get some steps in, so I got my other exercise all the way at the other end, and just kind of going back and forth. So uh, I'll be able to kind of pull that back a little bit and just kind of see what I can do that's going to be the least invasive, in terms of space and equipment and stuff like that. I've called this time, and I think I'm going to name this episode "Gains in the Time of Corona," um, because it's interesting seeing how different people responded to training during this time. Not many people are fortunate like you to have home gym set up, or like me who have, you know, a gym they can still go to without, breaking any laws or whatever. And I don't know, did you still have clients training during all of this?
Some of them were doing things through like virtual training that the gym called Anytime Fitness in Lebanon, the one I work at. They
Mm-hmm.
kind of set it up for clients. So I think a few of them were still kind of doing virtual training, um, you know, so that was kind of nice. But I don't think they've been able to physically train. I'll send workouts to some people that have like a gym at home, so have clients that have a squat rack and things like that, so I can send them workouts. But I think they've kind of done what they could do with body weight stuff, and kind of exhausted all you can do there. But yeah, I think some of them have been working out.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I don't have a lot of clients who didn't have access to weights at all, but I did have a few, and I was a little dismayed that some of them just kind of were like, I'm just not going to do anything, like I'm just going to use this 2 months as extended rest time, and that's fine if someone chooses to do that, and they're willing to accept the kind of, I don't want to say risk, you're not going to die from not training or anything, but for us, where this is very important to us, that's risky, and if they're willing to accept that risk of losing out on progress or hypertrophy or whatever, that's fine. But then it was the ones that lamented not having the gym, lamented not being able to train, but still did nothing, despite giving them exercises, giving them plenty to do, and I think that that's where, as coaches, it becomes really important to emphasize the principles over just the programs. If you manipulate the principles, intelligently, I mean, you can do some amazing things at home. You can get away with, next to nothing. Now, granted, it's easier for someone like me whose principal goal is hypertrophy. For a strength athlete, and a power lifter, something can be said for not being able to have a barbell in your hands. Like that's tough, no way to kind of get around that. But when you think about it from a hypertrophy standpoint, which is important for both physique and strength athletes, all the principles that apply when you're using load still apply, in the absence of that load, at least significant load. Would you say that you've experienced something like that?
Yeah, definitely. For the other thing too to be said is a lot of people may have equipment at home, but it's limited. So you may have someone that's a 500-pound deadlifter, but only has 300, pounds in plates, which is very, very common. So for those people, I had them, implementing tempo things, pauses, just different variations to make it harder. Because as a strength athlete, you got to go somewhat heavy to get stronger. But you don't have to have a lot of weight to get healthier or stay in maintenance. That's the good news there. So, I agree with you. I mean, these 2 months off, you could either sit around and say, hey, let me just recover, or let me try to get better, or let me, continue to stay focused, whatever that might be. But I think you can find ways to work principles into even times like this when you don't have much, like the principle of saying, let me try 30 push-ups 1 week, and then the next week I will overload that by, maybe doing 2 sets of 30 push-ups. You can't really manipulate the load with push-ups. I mean, you can put stuff on your back, but I mean, there's different ways to change change progress and, progressively overload. So definitely makes you think more as a coach when you're trying to give out those programs.
Yeah, I mean, and what it really, when you're saying all that, what it really boils down to me is effort. And I don't mean like a person going in and giving 100%, but I mean like actual perceived effort when training, proximity from failure. So like you say you have that deadlifter who pulls 500 something pounds and they only have 300 pounds of load. They may not be able to specifically pull, higher, threshold numbers or pulling, higher percentages, but there's still so much that can be done. You can get a lot of intensity out of 300 pounds if you're even a 600-pound deadlifter. Let's say you're doing 50%, okay? The rep range can obviously is probably going to have to go up. Like you said, you play with tempo. I try to keep athletes at on compound exercises around anywhere from like a 6 RPE. For anybody who doesn't know what RPE is, it's rate of perceived exertion. It's basically a way of quantifying effort or intensity. I try to have people, anywhere from a 5 up to a 7 or an 8 on compound exercises. And then on some more isolated stuff, we generally don't drop below a 6 or a 7, and very strategic with, RPE 8s and 9s, and even, going to true failure when it's someone who is very, very, well advanced and, has really good technique, and I know that they can recover from it, and it's very rare that I prescribe that even then, but there are some contexts in which that makes sense. So if you're a 300-pound deadlifter and you're having to do 50% of your 1RM, well, doing sets of, 15 to 18 with that is going to be pretty stimulative, and I can almost guarantee that RPE is going to get up there pretty quick, especially in the case of a powerlifter who maybe hasn't explored, higher rep ranges or done as much, of training in that way.
Yeah. And I think, too, variation plays a huge role, kind of what I touched on before. I'm a conventional puller, and I'm not built for sumo. There's probably about 100-pound difference between my sumo and my conventional. So for me, pulling
because of your short T-Rex arms, right?
Yeah. So, for me, pulling sumo at 300 would be still pretty easy. But, if I start adding sets of 12 tempos, that's going to boost the RPE up pretty quickly. So, it's just a matter of what do I have and what is my goal. I think a lot of people get, even if you're not a powerlifter, if you don't even care how you look, but you want to lose weight or you want to feel better, you still have to have a goal, and your training, needs to sort of reflect that goal. How badly do I want to, get in shape? How badly do I want to fit in this dress? What do I need to do to get there? Whatever your goal is. So I think as coaches, that's good to, look at the person and see what their goal is, but also see kind of like, what are they likely to do? Are they likely to worry about, bumping up their 15 rep max, or, are they going to, what are they going to do in these 2 months? I think that's what's going to be important for coaches to really think about.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to stay relevant, but now I just keep picturing you in a dress because of your goal of fitting in that dress.
Right.
I think that, you've got the short arm thing going on, so we'd have to have something, that doesn't come too far down. So we don't want to play that length too much, but no, but what you said about what a client's going to worry about, or going to think about, or even is going to be meaningful to them, that there's a lot in that, because if a client, let's say their goal is fat loss, and we're trying to optimize programming, during this time where they don't have gym access, and, you recommend blood flow restriction, Bulgarian split squats, and they're gonna say, fuck you, there's no way, so, maybe it's probably going to be more effective or more stimulative, but for them, if we can keep them doing some walking lunges and some body weight squats, that may be, enough.
Right. Yeah. And a lot can be said about just maintenance. I mean, you're not going to lose your gains in 2 months. Now, obviously, if you're more at an advanced level, yeah, you're going to notice some difference, in hypertrophy and some strength, but that's going to come back quickly. The biggest thing is if you don't do anything in 2 months, it's going to be very hard to come back. I remember I took an entire month off of lifting just from after a meet just because I was feeling beat up. And I think we were talking at one point, and I had told you, man, I don't even want to do this anymore. Like, the motivation was gone just from not lifting a single anything for an entire month. So 2 months, I could only imagine. I mean, even if you're just out walking, just doing something to get your mind in sort of that workout mode will be helpful.
Oh man, yeah. Deviating from the mentality for some can have really devastatingly long-term consequences. There's some people who, and that may be, obviously probably a topic for another podcast, but that may be indicative of there needing to be a mental shift anyway, if they get to that point,
Right.
But, I've seen, unfortunately, even some clients where, I'm a little worried that they're not going to make it back in, because they just went to a whole different place when all this came in, and it may have been necessary. It may have been their way of coping, and I'm not one to, poo-poo on anybody else's way of getting through, what's a pretty significant event. I know it's difficult for me as a coach because, we just want the best for everybody. We want, I think a good coach doesn't even see a person. Obviously we see them for how they are, but we see them also for how they could be, and the potential that they have. And so it's frustrating when you see somebody with immense capability and potential, and they kind of squander it. Even you would hope that even in a time like this, they would still keep some, like you said, even just walking some semblance of their goal in mind. And I think it's really important that, if someone does have a goal, that even when times change, that they kind of have to change along with it and they have to adapt.
Definitely. Yeah, that's true. And I think now that we were talking about gyms opening up and things kind of going back to normal, I think it'd be good for people to start looking towards, opening up, like what kind of things they could be doing, and what should they be doing. You hear a lot of people saying, I want to test my 1 rep max, or I want to see how much body fat I gained, or this or that. And I think this will now be a new challenge for people to see what it's like coming back to the gym. Whether they were keeping up with it or not. I know for me, I look forward kind of to go back to working, but I really like lifting alone. And there was no one there. There was no one asking me questions right before I lift. There was, I didn't have any music or anything. So I'm going to miss that aspect of it. But, that's a small piece. But for the people that are, feeling like they fell off the wagon and they don't want to, go back at it again, that I think that's the people that need to really think about how bad they want it, and also get the knowledge they need as to what do I do when I come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, man. It's one thing to not have the motivation, and as a coach, we can't really help with that. But I think sometimes that's tied into a person not having any idea what to do. Maybe they weren't already killing it in the gym. They were just kind of, I'm kind of there. And this just kind of sent them all the way off. But if they have that knowledge and they know, like, these are the kinds of things to do when I go back, then it may give them a little spark and say, hey, okay, well, I may not know all that I need to do, but I know I've got a plan in place, and I've got some steps towards a goal that I have. What would you say are some of those steps that somebody, that's either taking this as a layoff and coming back, or somebody who's kind of just still getting into the whole strength training world? What do they need to do, to be successful?
I think it will depend on what their goal is, but and this goes for everyone, is just mostly just taking it slow and don't try to compare yourself to who you were 2 months ago. Even if you did have the ability to lift, while you're gone, it may change a little bit. I had the luxury of waking up whenever I wanted, or whenever my 3-year-old woke me up, which was usually around 9:30 or 10, which is pretty darn late.
Yeah.
So, things are going to change. I'll have to go in earlier, and that will change, my workout times, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but it can affect that. And I think people just need to not try to compare themselves to who they were 2 months ago. Make sure they take things slow. If they are getting back into it, or they've never done it before, I should say, and they want to start up now, get yourself, a good coach, and make sure you're taking the proper steps. We talked about principles, and we touched on progressive overload a little bit, but make sure that you're choosing the right exercise selection. There's a million and one exercises out there, and when you go to a gym, most of the time, those machines, you don't really need them right away when you're first starting out. Get yourself a good coach to find out what exercises are going to help me, progress, and which ones are kind of just, you don't need them right now, or I can use them if I want to, but they're not essential, kind of thing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really good advice. I mean, I guess I didn't think about, how we all will experience this to some degree, going back, like you said, going to lift at a different time, someone going into the gym for the first time. Personally, I've, like you, have been lifting alone, and I've loved that time. And I'm still a little leery of personal interaction with all of this going on. And I'm a little worried with how not being close to people is going to affect my performance directly, but just the mental aspect of being worried about it. It's like, oh man, they're kind of in my bubble a little bit, and that, kind of messing with performance a little bit. But the answer for everyone involved, no matter what level we're all at, it still boils down to those principles. Like you said, real basic tenets of exercise selection and picking, probably multi-joint movements to choose as your exercise that you want to progress over time, with maybe some isolation things to supplement that as you go. Again, regardless of the goal, whether you're a power lifter, bodybuilder, or just, general fitness enthusiast. What's your kind of general recommendation as far as, let's say, a person that knows all the exercises they want to do, how do they go about setting up their training?
So if it was just like a general person, like I just want to get in shape, you kind of got to, a push-pull kind of setup is usually good, meaning, you have an exercise that you're pushing, like a bench or pulling, like pull-ups or things like that. You set a certain day for that, and then maybe the other day you're doing back exercises or pulling exercises. In terms of like, oh, you need to hit arms here and there. I feel like it's just really going to boil down to just keeping things basic. Making sure that you are, like you said, hitting the multi-joint exercise, such as the squats, overhead press or bench, pull-ups, or if you want to do deadlifts, you can. Making sure that you get those in, and then the isolation movements can trickle on down from there. So I think that's where I would go with it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm of a similar approach. Again, it's always context dependent. There's no universal approach or one size fits all. And any coach who has like, oh, well, this is my hypertrophy template or my hypertrophy plan, that they're kind of full of shit, because there's no one plan or even one set of exercises that can be universally applied to everybody. In a real general sense, if I have a rank beginner, like a complete novice lifter, typically I take a full body approach, anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week. Again, part of that is for adherence sake. If a person has never been a gym goer, I can't ask them to go into the gym 4 or 5 times a week, because the likelihood of them going into what can be kind of an intimidating place is low. So if we set the bar I don't want to say set the bar low, but we set the expectations reasonably. I think 2 to 3 times a week of training is reasonable. And there's good research that indicates that there can be a pretty significant hypertrophic response to hard sets, or again, though that RPE range of probably within 4 reps shy of failure and down. 8 of those sets per body part per week, all the way up to 20. So I would say that a ranked beginner, anywhere from 8 to 12 sets per week is all they're going to need, and then you just divide that up accordingly to the times per week they're going to be in the gym. Prioritizing those compound multi-joint exercises, and making sure they're at least attempting to get 2 times a week in frequency per body part. But even then, again, a complete novice can get a lot out of most anything, as long as it's fairly appropriate.
Right. And you touched on something when you said the full body thing. I think that's something that's very important, especially when you're talking about beginners. I was kind of taking a general template of a push-pull day, for someone, you have like a push-pull day and then maybe you do legs. That's not something that all beginners have to do. In fact, looking back at the question, I agree as well about a full body day for beginners, because they're going to be able to take more punishment, so to speak, than, someone like you or me. And the reason I say that's a good point is because I've talked to many beginners where, if you mention full body day, they're like, whoa, aren't I going to overtrain? Aren't I going to, my testosterone going to drop, or am I going to lose my, like, full body days for a beginner is perfect. Actually, I think. So the reason I wanted to bring that up is just as soon as you said full body, it just reminded me of some of those conversations I've had with beginners where they're like, well, I can't do full body. Bodybuilding.com says, my CNS will fry, or
Yeah.
Men's Health says you can't hit squats 2 days in a row. The likelihood is you're not even approaching enough, overload or volume to even generate any sort of fatigue, let alone overtraining yet. So I think that's another good point that you brought up in terms of the full body.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and again, not every beginner is the same, but in general, someone who has not lifted or knows what failure feels like, they don't know how hard, that they have to really push. That's why in-person training can be valuable. And I know that you do in-person training, as I do as well here, because you can actually see the effort level that the client is exhibiting, and you can say, come on, man, like you're kind of phoning it in here. You've got more in the tank. But for any clients that you may have that's remote, I mean, we've touched on RPE. Would you think that's a way to, talk about how hard you need to be working, or is there another way that you do that?
These questions for me are always hard because I always think of the millions of situations. And of course, as a powerlifter, I always think of a powerlifting situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, RPE is a great way to indicate it, with the caveat of saying someone's RPE can look different than someone else's, meaning I could hit an RPE 9, which maybe one left in the tank, and you could hit an RPE 9, but the speeds of our RPEs 9s can look drastically different. Mm-hmm. Some people can just fly through an RPE 9, and someone said, man, you had 3 more left. No, trust me, this was an RPE 9, and vice versa. I think you really have to have some experience with the client to say, okay, that is an RPE 9. That guy really only had 1 left in the tank. Because even as myself, when I first started doing RPE, it takes a while. Like, did I have 1 left in the tank? Did I not? And me and you a bit loosely touched on velocity-based training, which is a similar way to auto-regulate yourself in terms of how fast the bar moving. But even that, it's hard to tell. But I think RPE is definitely a good way to sort of regulate it. For my online people, I make them send me videos because I don't trust when they say, this or that. Not that I don't trust them, but like the effort thing we were talking about, you want to see what kind of effort they're putting in and the form. Like I've had people say, man, I nailed it. So, okay, cool. Send me a video. And you see, let's work on that, you know? So I think visually seeing it is one way to sort of rate RPE as a coach, but then you also have to make sure that they're experienced enough to say, okay, I think this was an RPE, whatever.
Oh man, yeah, that's really good, because I think, and we talked about this off the air, about how there are details in online coaching, you know, that in some way, you know, make it a bit more difficult than in person, because we're not regularly in person seeing the person, you know, display the exercise. And so we don't always know what their technique is like. We don't always know what their range of motion is like. We don't know, you know, what their RPE and their sense of it is like, you know, outside of what they tell us. So it feels kind of, it makes me feel guilty to say, like, I don't trust them, you know, because I don't want to think that. But it is important to cover all of the bases. And I will usually apologize to a client in advance, especially when they first start working with me. I said, I apologize if I'm more detailed than you feel I need to be, but I'm going to be exhaustive, and I'm going to leave no stone unturned. I'm going to address everything. And if that's kind of set out at the outset, then we can always pull back and say, okay, well, they don't need this. They're good in this regard. They're good in this regard. I can kind of pull back. But yeah, I mean, something with RPE, I mean, it is subjective, and knowing what that is for yourself is one thing, and then knowing it for what a client is demonstrating is a whole nother ball game, and then them knowing it for themselves. So that's the only method that I kind of use remotely anyway to quantify effort. Now, keep in mind, I don't work with generally people who are just coming out of the gate, you know, online, because I almost don't even take clients online that are ranked beginners, not because they can't stand to help of a good coach. It's just very, very difficult to demonstrate for them everything that they need at the very beginning of that process. And I'm sure you and other coaches, you know, may excel at that. That's difficult for me, having a ranked beginner online. Like I can tell them in all the terms I know, but there's no way for me to help them to just know what that feels like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've never had a beginner online. I don't like the feeling of not being able to show them this is how you do set exercise. You know, because there's a lot that goes into an exercise if it's done right. I don't like to show them that, not be able to show them that, because it's just it's a weird feeling, because it feels like you have no control of their progress then.
Yeah, and you're leaving things to chance that could be pretty detrimental. I mean, I guess if you're keeping a close eye on video and monitoring like crazy, just monitor, maybe even bi-weekly check-ins as opposed to weekly check-ins, I think it can work well, because I'm not trying to dissuade anybody who's a ranked beginner from hiring an online coach. You know,
Right.
that's kind of counter to what we want. But there has to be caution exercised, and that's even more reason why they should pick a knowledgeable coach and not somebody who's just going to completely wreck them, because it's nuanced, and there's a lot that goes into this. And even at the beginning of a training career, you can get into some murky waters if you're not careful. And so it's important to make a good decision, and that's why, you know, a good coach who knows these principles and can manipulate them is invaluable. So we talked about this person, you know, they're getting into the gym. We're saying that, you know, they probably need a coach, you know, if they're a ranked beginner, and preferably probably an in-person coach. But if there's not someone in person that they can trust, you know, if they can't get a hold of you in person, they can hire you online, and it's almost just as good. And then we need to quantify our effort. We need to, in some way, know that we have to work hard, but then we have to manage fatigue as well. So that means not going to complete failure, but that also means not being a complete sandbagger and leaving, 10 or 12 reps in the tank. That there's got to be some way of meeting in the middle, and RPE might be a good way of doing that. We've also talked about the full body approach for, kind of a novice lifter. It may be a good way to organize training depending on the schedule and the access a person has. But that it's really going to boil down to those anywhere from 8 to probably 12 for a novice lifter, hard sets per muscle group per week, and then dividing that up as you go. And I think that really, with that and the exercise selection, I think we've kind of covered kind of the rank beginner. We don't have a whole lot more time, but I wanted to talk about what someone who has been in the gym for quite some time. So we'll talk about, maybe anywhere from an intermediate to an advanced lifter who's been training during this time, but it's been without a barbell in their hand. So they've been doing body weight exercises, or like some of the videos you showed me, finding people lifting cement blocks and things like that. I know that we said that they need to kind of take it easy going into the gym, but what does that look like?
It talks a lot we were talking a lot about, the 8 to 12 sets per, week per body part for, beginner. Advanced lifter is should have a similar idea of how many sets they're doing per week, or were doing this 2 months prior. I would take those sets and really, you don't necessarily have to cut them in half, but really go below that sort of threshold of what you were doing before. Slowly work up that volume. Don't try to be a hero and try to set a PR, or, let me try to add more weight. Slowly, back into that, and you're going to see progress fast. And you may even find, hey, I was doing too much volume.
Yeah.
I could have just been okay with this, because I'm doing fine with, I was doing 15 sets and now I'm doing 8, and then just making more progress. So I think, for that intermediate to advanced, it's going to be good to kind of take a look at that. And for those strength athletes, don't try to max out unless you had the ability to do so during that break time. Really try to follow along the same path as the volume that we were talking about before. Set your volume a little bit lower than you were doing before and build your way back up.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good practical advice, and you hit the nail on the head. That reduction in volume. All of the mechanisms involving hypertrophy are still a little unexplored. I mean, we know some things, and then there's just a lot of shit we just don't know, right? But there is a relationship between training volume and fatigue, and it stands to reason if prior to all of this, first of all, it really means that, like, it emphasizes a data-driven approach. So we're assuming that people have quantified their volume and people have tracked their training and, know what, they were doing before. So I guess backing up a little bit, that should take place. Track your training, know how many working sets you're doing per muscle group per week, or at least have a rough idea. Because otherwise, how do you know what manipulations to make if you don't have a baseline, right? So if we're assuming that has taken place, and these are people who have tracked their training, some reduction in volume is necessary. Not because you're going to be weaker or less muscular, but because
your fitness will be down.
Exactly, that whole fitness versus fatigue.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I don't, when we say fitness, we don't mean, beach body fitness. We're talking more about, preparedness to, take that stimulus that you did before, because that's really what your body's lacking. It hasn't been under that stimulus before, unless you've been doing exactly what you were doing before you left the gym. You know, we had talked about, you know, making sure that you're tracking your training. You know, if you weren't before and you watch this podcast, hopefully you are now, or it will begin to, because it makes a world of difference. Because when things like this happen, hopefully it doesn't happen like this again, but, you know, there'll be times where you get sick, or, you know, you have to fly out of town or whatever. How do you go back and, you know, look at where you were before, so I can track my progress or lay off if I need to? Because it really will make a world of difference, just tracking, like you said, working sets and things like that, and intensities.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested, I'll link a couple things in the description box. The recommendations for hypertrophy anyway come from lots of different sources, but they've kind of agreed that anywhere from, again, 8 sets at the bottom end to 20 sets per muscle group per week is ideal. And then think of it as a spectrum, and everybody falls somewhere on there. So in my experience, most people that I've worked with are, again, right in the middle or somewhere in the middle of that recommendation, and tend to do anywhere from 12 to 16 sets per week. And that seems to be where they make really good progress and are able to recover. And their fitness to fatigue ratio, you know, is balanced, right? So if we take a person who's doing 16 sets per body part per week, I think that one possible way to deal with all this is using deloads as a potential template for what to do when you go back. So let's say that, you know, a person was doing 16 sets for chest or whatever, but on deload weeks they do 10. Well, that might be a great place to start, is starting with the deload, you know, and seeing, you know, how you respond, and then maybe adding a set each week until you're back up to your maintenance volume. Or there's so many ways people are talking about minimum effective dose and maximum adaptive volume and all of that. I'm not getting into any of that. However you want to, you know, quantify it or call it. But taking that low end, that deload kind of, those deload numbers that you might normally use, and then working your way back up to that. Would you say that might be a viable approach?
Yeah, definitely. If you plan your deloads correctly, that would be a good way to do that. Like you said, this is all assuming the person was, you know, tracking their training before, and they could look back at their deloads. I think one interesting thing, this is kind of off topic, that you had mentioned is the amount of sets per week that you'd mentioned, and not necessarily a rep range. You know, a lot of people tend to think, oh, hypertrophy 6 to 12, strength this to this. I have been running this protocol where you squat to a single every day, and it's just that. It's 7 days a week, but I've noticed hypertrophic gains from just hitting a single every day. Granted, it's 7 days a week. I'm still getting probably 14 working sets, because I count the last one up as a pretty heavy working set. And so that's still a decent amount of sets for the legs. So that's something to keep in mind too, for those of you listening, is it's not necessarily about, you know, the rep ranges, although I wouldn't recommend doing it that way if you're looking for hypertrophy, doing 7 days a week of a single exercise. But tracking your sets is going to be really beneficial in terms of, you know, tracking your training overall. And when we're saying working sets, we're meaning sets that you would, you know, deem hard. You know, we're not counting on 135, 225, or whatever it is, how you warm up. We're tracking, you know, the last, you know, whatever becomes hard, basically. That's, you know, if you're going to track your training, that's what we're looking at, is the things after the warm-ups, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because it kind of goes beyond the scope of this episode. But, you know, talking about intensity and proximity from failure, as long as there is a potent enough stimulus, you know, hypertrophy will ensue, and it has to take place over a long enough period of time in terms of the amount of repetitions you're doing, you know, to get you enough time for that to provide enough stimulus long enough to produce those gains. And so when you think of it as stimulus as opposed to like rep ranges, you realize that everything is stimulative, or can be potentially. Like everything can build muscle. And my coach Brian Miner kind of introduced this kind of concept to me, and it was just like mind-blowing, because it really allows there to be a lot more flexibility in programming, because you're not married to one specific rep range or strategy or whatever. Just like you said, you're doing heavy singles. You can't tell me that that's not in some way stimulative of growth, and many bros will have issue with that, and like you said, we're not saying that it's the optimal way, to get a hypertrophic response. But let's look at, Ray Williams, and all the singles and doubles and triples. That man is one of the most massive human beings on the planet.
He's a freak too, though.
He definitely is. He definitely is. He's definitely a hyper responder to training. So we shouldn't take him and be like, he train like Ray Williams and you'll get big as fuck.
This podcast is train like Ray Williams.
Train like Ray Williams. That's what you need to do. But you can't tell me there isn't some merit to, those higher intensities and not being in that quote unquote, hypertrophy range. But I would say that it boils mostly down to efficiency, so if hypertrophy is the goal, it's not efficient to do singles, doubles, triples, or fours, right? It's possible to achieve a hypertrophic outcome doing that, but it's probably not the least cost-effective way to do that, right? Those higher intensities are also going to be, like we talked about, fatigue. They're going to be, I don't want to say necessarily more fatiguing, but they're definitely going to be harder to some degree on the connective tissue. And it's just harder to psych yourself up for a heavy single, double, or triple, for enough repetitions and sets in order to use that as like your hypertrophy program. I think that it becomes a little bit more efficient. And that's why when people talk about the hypertrophy rep range, it's really not a special range for hypertrophy. It's just probably the middle ground. So I would say that's anywhere from 5 or 6 reps up to 20 reps. It makes sense to, base your training in somewhere in between there if your goal is hypertrophy. So if you want to build muscle, you can do that with heavy sixes, and you can do that with, sets of 20. And the research kind of indicates that the outcomes are very similar. We think like, oh, I went from 6s to 12s. There's going to be a significantly doubling in hypertrophy. And it's just not that stark of a difference. It's there's no real miracle or set way that you have to do it. I would say that compound exercises lend themselves pretty well, from 6 to 12 reps maybe, and then saving the 12 and on for things that are isolation moves and things like that, because who wants to do sets of 15 on squats? I mean, really, like you're asking for not only the worst DOMs of your life, but you're going to probably throw up in that session. You're going to puke. Matter of fact, I remember doing, it's somewhat related. We were training arms together. And this was after I had kind of like went through my powerlifting phase and I had started competing. And so I came back up to, I think you were still at that gym in Mason. Or no, we went to Crunch or something like that.
Yeah.
And we did arms, and you were like, I'm kind of nauseous.
Oh, yeah.
You feel kind of sick when we were doing arms.
I remember that. I was just doing arms. I felt like a bitch.
It's so funny because I have a really good friend up in Cincinnati, Farron Willis, and he's a pro natural bodybuilder as well. And I used to be the power lifter lifting with him and feeling nauseous doing anything. And he wasn't doing anything like drop sets to failure or anything like that. He'd be like, all right, we're doing 4x12 stiff like a deadlift. So I'm like, all right, cool. And after like 4 reps, I'm like, I'm gonna die. Like I'm most assuredly gonna die,
No.
And it's only been in the last 4 or 5 years where I made the switch and became more of a physique athlete, where like now that's just commonplace, you know.
Yeah.
But that actually, you know, if we're talking about people going into the gym, you know, and wanting to come and kill it and get back to normal, we've talked about reducing the number of sets that they probably do. And like you said, you probably don't need to do half, but I would say anywhere from half to 2/3 of your normal volume would be probably pretty ideal. But let's say that the person, in addition to a goal of hypertrophy, they are a power lifter. They have, would you say that there's potential for doing maybe working up to a easy single at like a 7 or an 8, you know, prior to their working sets?
Like they haven't been able to work out before, and this is their first day back kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a smart move, as long as you're honest with yourself.
Yeah.
RPE. And for those of you unfamiliar with it, I know Malcolm talked about RPE, meaning, you know, how much you have left in the tank. It's very easy to kid yourself on, you know, how much you have left in the tank. So you have to make sure you're honest, especially for a strength athlete, that you're honest with that. So if you come back and the results are not something you like, you have to just cut it, whatever the RPE was. But yeah, I think that would be a smart move. Kind of say, okay, this is day one. Let me do some back off sets. This is my start point for the data. Now I can, you know, move on up from there, instead of let me just try to do what I did before, or let me go way under what I did before. I think working up to you know, 1 at RP 7 or 8 is good.
Yeah, it's like gradual exposure to the stimulus once again, you know, and
Yeah.
I've heard other, you know, really good coaches kind of comment that way, you know. It's a gradient, you know. You're not just hopping right back into the mix, but you're exposing yourself back to the higher loads, you know, but you're doing it in a conservative way. So an RPE 7, when you've had a layoff, you know, if you're honest, you know, it's going to still be lighter than it was before, you know, an RPE 7, but it's also not going to wreck you for the rest of the week, you know, and it's not going to make you just like hate your life the rest of the day. It's going to be like a solid single that, you know, you could have done 3 or 4 more reps or 2 or 3 more reps, and you call it there and do your working sets. And like you said, this could be a real opportunity for people to see, even in the terms of intensity. Maybe, you know, a power lifter doesn't have to be doing singles at an 8 or 9. Maybe they can get away with increasing their 7 or 8, you know, singles, instead of, you know, kind of blowing their load more often.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you talk about volume and things like that, in what works and what doesn't, there's a huge context to be talked about, and I'll just touch on a little bit because you go on forever. But when I was talking about the squatting 7 days a week thing, I wasn't trying to get bigger legs. It just happened. But I think one of the big reasons was, for whatever reason, I was only squatting once a week prior. So then when you come into that and you hit 7 days a week, that stimulus is insane. So you're going to see that big growth. And I'm not saying everyone do this, but it's the same thing for, like, if you'd have a layoff, you know, you're going to get a stimulus and you're going to get that muscle back, but you also may find, hey, I should have been doing it like this to begin with. So when I do, you know, go back to my regular training, I'm not going to be squatting every day, but I'll probably be squatting 3-4 times a week. I'm not saying that everyone needs to be doing that, but for me, I wasn't seeing the gains that I needed to, and this layoff really helped me see that. So for other people, it may be the opposite. Maybe they're doing too much, and they're like, you know what, let me back it down. And I think me and you were both talking about, you had mentioned that you were going to stop deadlifting or ease off on about for a few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I did something similar after a slight injury, and I looked back at some of the data that I'd collected and saying, my deadlift up to, you know, 85% does not do well with the volume that I was doing. Let me back it off. And if it wasn't for this quarantine, I might have not have really thought of that. I just would have kept trying to drive through.
Yeah, because we're so married to our approach sometimes. And what's funny, I think as coaches, we're way more likely to be open when it comes to our clients. But then when it's our own training, we're like, oh, no, fuck that. I gotta do what I know I'm supposed to do, you know. But it's good that, you know, you use this opportunity. And I think that that's a big takeaway to kind of wrap it up here, is to capitalize on this regardless of where a person's starting. You know, if it's a person getting back into the gym after the layoff, you know, and they still kept their goals in mind and they trained as best they could, to be conservative, you know, and we've already given some pretty good practical results, and I'll put some in the description box. Or if a person's just starting off, like there's lots of different ways to capitalize on this time, you know, and I think we have to think of it not as a daunting task, but as a really cool opportunity, you know, to either see if what we were doing before worked, or, you know, getting a fresh start and seeing like, all right, let me start and see what happens moving on from here.
Yeah, it's a different perspective.
Yeah, man, for sure, because we know that perspective is everything. But hey, man, I've appreciated having you on. This was both of us losing our video chat virginity, so I hope it was gentle.
Yeah. Well, we had talked about doing this for forever, and we finally did it. So.
Oh man, years. Yeah, years. So cheers, man. This was great. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Definitely, man. Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And for one more time for the listeners, what's your business called?
Stout Performance. STOUT Performance.
Cool. And then where can people find you? Do you have social media, email, things like that?
Yeah, just my Instagram, which is just the Stout Performance handle. If you just type in Stout Performance, you type in my name, Kenton Stout, I'll come up. I should come up on Instagram.
And then just look for the shortest arms on Instagram and they'll find you, right?
Yeah, the shortest, pretty much, man. That's my claim to fame.
This guy has the shortest arms on Instagram. And then, can they reach out to you for coaching through there? Is that the best place to reach out to you?
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome, man. And I'll link that in the description box as well. Kenton, have a good night, brother.
Hey, man, you too. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
How you do?